Hello, I'm Lauren Haldeman, Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Nutrition Education and Behavior, where we are advancing research, practice, and policy. And each month, we select an article to feature as a press release with an accompanying podcast. Today's podcast article can be read in full at www.jneb.org for free for the next 3 months. And today, I'm really happy to be speaking with Dr. Juliana Cohen, who is the corresponding author for the article titled Deimplementing Universal Free School Meals, Impact on School Food Authorities. I'm really glad to have you with us today, Juliana. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. First, I'd just like to say thank you so much to you and the journal for this opportunity to share our results. So I'm a professor of nutrition and the director of the Center for Health Innovation, Research and Policy at Merrimack College. And I also have a secondary appointment at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health in the Department of Nutrition. And so my work focuses on evaluating school nutrition policies and interventions to improve health outcomes and reduce disparities in children, looking at their health, but also academic outcomes, mental health, food security, etc. So we work very closely with policymakers or organizations that work closely with policymakers to answer questions that will be most helpful at informing policies.
Great. Thanks so much. And your article for this podcast hits the nail on the head with that. So can you talk to us a little bit about the paper itself, the work that you've done?
Absolutely. So what we did was a survey among school food authorities. So kind of simply put, food service directors, those that are in charge of school nutrition. And we did this large survey with 941 school food authorities across 8 states in the United States. Some of them had universal free school meal policies, whereby all children in the entire state had access to free school meals. We also interviewed food service directors in states that had recently de-implemented universal free school meals. The reason for this, the backstory, is that during COVID, for the first time ever, we had this national universal free school meal policy to try and address some of the major challenges that we were dealing with during the COVID pandemic. So all children throughout the U.S. had this for just a short period of time. After those pandemic waivers ended, a handful of states decided to pass state-level laws to continue with this policy, and then others defaulted to ending that universal free school meal policy. So we really wanted to understand what was the impact of ending universal free school meals on school food authorities. So what we did was we surveyed in states with and without these universal free school meal state level policies to really understand what was the impact on school meal participation rates, food service revenues, staffing needs, things like administrative burden, and also really importantly, we looked at student stigma and meal debt as well in these schools.
Thanks. It seems like you had your own natural experiment then.
Exactly.
Can you tell us a little bit about the results?
Yeah, so first, the thing that we found, which really was not surprising, is that in states that ended free school meals, there were huge declines in school meal participation, but also really importantly, decreases in food service revenues as well. And this is really important for a number of reasons. We need these revenues, one, to be able to support the staff, the cafeteria staff that's making fresh, healthy meals for these students. We know ultra-processed foods is all in the news right now. Well, one of the things that we need to be able to make those scratch cooked meals is the staff. They can also use that money to be able to buy more fresh produce, which is oftentimes more expensive than those that are prepackaged. So that was some of the initial findings that we had. But additionally, we found that with ending universal free school meals, there was an increase in school meal debt and also perceived stigma from students from low-income households as well. One thing to note, though, is that in states that had universal free school meals still, there were still some higher food service staffing challenges. Or another way of saying that is states that de-implemented free school meals, they reported lower staffing challenges. And that's also not totally surprising because with universal free school meals, we see much greater participation, which is a good thing. And there are some challenges associated with that when you're feeding a lot more kids in the same lunch period.
Sure. So you mentioned school meal debt. Can you talk a little bit about the impact that debt has on a school?
Yeah, I think what's particularly important, what many people don't realize, is that when there's school meal debt at the end of the year, and this is typically because a child may go through the lunch line, they maybe don't have money on their account, and schools don't want to turn these kids away. This is a kid who's hungry, and they'll often still provide a meal. As a result of that, this happens multiple times over the school years with multiple children. We've seen school districts that have accumulated over $100,000 in school meal debt. Where does that money come from? People don't realize this often actually comes from the broader school's funding. So this can be the difference between being able to hire a new teacher. This can be after school programming. This impacts the broader school community as well. And so what this research really found was that universal free school meals, where all kids have access to free meals, this can benefit schools because it eliminates that school meal debt. And what that also means is it can also benefit the school more broadly, including thinking about academics and making sure that we're not having to reallocate funding that should otherwise be able to be used just for education.
And those are some pretty serious implications. And I know schools do face sometimes very large school meal debt. So to be able to reduce that, it would be a wonderful way to enhance the schools. So you touched on a couple of different factors, but what are the broader implications for these reductions in school meal participation?
So some of the biggest things that we see with school meal participation is one, it can really drive food insecurity among children. A lot of households who are eligible for free meals don't apply because of the stigma, because of the barriers, these complicated application forms that they have to fill out. And then many families are not eligible, but they're really struggling. Especially we see rising food costs right now. A lot of households are really struggling. And so many kids can be missing out on this incredibly important nutrition. Additionally, when there's the stigma associated with school meals, we see that kids who are even eligible and already enrolled in free school meals are less likely to take them. Because there's so much stigma around it. And so these higher levels of participation make a big difference in terms of addressing food insecurity and really enabling kids to have all the nutrition that they need to be their best, for schools to do their primary role, which is to educate children. We can't do that when kids are hungry.
Sure. Thank you for that. So we're seeing a lot of changes at the federal level in our federal food assistance programs. I want to touch on one. Can you discuss how the new cuts to SNAP might impact the access to school meals in states that have de-implemented the universal free school meals?
That's a really important thing to discuss because a lot of people don't realize there's a strong connection between enrollment in SNAP and free school meals. And the first way that this is important is because if a family is already enrolled in SNAP, that child automatically gets free school meals. So on an individual level, that makes a huge difference, not having to go through this complicated application process. It's easier for schools and it's easier for families. But then additionally, if more kids are not being enrolled in free school meals, enrollment in these programs like SNAP or other what we call means tested programs, meaning that they've already assessed these households' income, assessed that they're low income. That's what's used for what we have in the United States called the Community Eligibility Provision, also known as CEP. This enables higher poverty schools or school districts to provide free meals to all schools or all schools within a district or higher poverty schools to all kids within that school or district. So this is still a way in states that have de-implemented universal statewide free meals for at least the highest poverty schools to get those free meals. However, if kids no longer enrolled in SNAP, you then have lower enrollment rates for these means tested programs, many schools are no longer going to be eligible to participate in CEP, in this free school meal program. So this is going to have a lot of really adverse implications for schools, for school meal participation, and for food insecurity.
It is so critical to see these connections between all the different federal food assistance programs and the impacts one has on the other and the other. I really appreciate the work that you're doing. It is so important, particularly as we're seeing the changes that we're seeing currently. I encourage you to continue with your messaging around these programs. I really enjoyed having you on the call today. Is there anything else that you'd like to mention?
Yeah, I just want to really briefly acknowledge first the co-authors on this paper, also the hundreds of food service directors who took the time out of their incredibly busy schedules to complete these surveys, and would also like to acknowledge our funders, Healthy Eating Research. And lastly, would really like to thank you and the journal for this opportunity to publish this. So we really appreciate it.
Sure thing. It's wonderful work. And thank you again, Juliana, for spending this time with me. And to all of our listeners, remember that you can read this article in full at www.jneb.org for free for the next 3 months.